A study of the Gospel of Matthew, Part 1, Lesson 2, The Birth of the King. This is Matthew 1:1 through to the end of the chapter, verse 23. The genealogy of the King. This is Matthew 1:1 through 17. Now, genealogies were important to the Jews because they showed the individual's place in the history of God's covenant people. There's a few Jews left on the face of the earth who can trace their genealogy pretty well continuous back to the genealogies that were kept in the temple before it was destroyed in 70 AD. Not many, because the records are not there. But you better believe that they can tell you who their family lineage is. I have a friend who now teaches in Witwatersrand University in Johannesburg, South Africa. His name is Derek Baum. And I asked him one time, the first time I ever met him, I said, Derek, are you a descendant of the great Rambam? And Rambam was a medieval Jewish rabbi. And he said, yes. He could tell me how many times great-grandfather he was back to somebody who lived in the 13th century. So that shows you how important genealogies were to the Jews. And so when a good Jew is going to write a gospel to other good believing Jews, he starts with the genealogy of the king. The purpose of this is to show, one of the purposes is to show that Jesus had the right lineage, that he was a descendant of Abraham, a descendant of Adam, a descendant of David, and that he was therefore qualified by birth to be the king. One of the other themes, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the lesson, is to show that Joseph was not the biological father of Jesus, but that he was born through the creative activity of the Holy Spirit. He immediately establishes that Jesus is the promised king by using such titles as Son of David, Son of Abraham. These are titles that the Jews themselves used to describe the Messiah. Matthew, like Paul, begins the story of the kingship of Jesus with Abraham, with whom God made a covenant and promised that all the nations of the earth, which includes us Gentile believers today, would be blessed by the family of Abraham. The genealogy was not meant to record every ancestor of Jesus, but was to establish Jesus as a member of the family of Abraham, and was thus the person through whom God would bless all nations. It also emphasized the plan of God as Lord of history by authoring his lineage anchoring his lineage to significant events in the history of God's covenant people. See, there's that narrative I'm talking about. Even in the genealogy, Matthew tells the narrative, the storyline of God's working through man. There were 14 generations from Abraham to David, which ended the earthly kingdom of Israel. 14 generations from David to the exile, which ended the earthly kingdom of Israel, thus preparing the way for the rule of Jesus from his resurrection to his return to judge all the nations. 14 generations from the ending of the earthly rule of the Davidic line in Israel to the birth of the Messianic king. Now I hope out of this little study of the genealogy, you have a better appreciation for what a genealogy is and the way that Matthew uses it. If we ever study the book of Luke together, Luke has a little different purpose in his genealogy, but each writer had their own purposes. They used the same material, but they had their own purpose in using it. The birth of the king. Matthew 1:18 to verse 25. The main emphasis of this section is to establish that Joseph was not the biological father of Jesus, but that his conception was due to the creative work of the Holy Spirit. Matthew continues by showing that his birth was a return to God's presence among his covenant people. Remember, there had been just short of 400 years of silence without an official spokesman from God speaking to the Jews. And don't think they weren't conscious of that. Much of the so-called intertestamental religious writing of the Jews dealt with that silence. Speculations as to why God had been silent, what it meant, whether it was something the Jews had done or some other influence on God. But they were aware of it. And so Matthew wanted the people to know, his readers to know, this is God returning, visiting his people again. Matthew continues by showing that his birth was, as I said, a return of God's presence to his covenant people, and that presence would be with them until the end of this present age, when Jesus would return to judge the living and the dead. Next minor section, the visit of the Magi, Matthew 2:1 through 13. The Magi were not kings, like the Christmas carol says. We three kings of Orient are. They were not kings. They were philosophers and wise men from the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The significance of their visit lies in their not being a part of God's covenant people and their recognition that Jesus was the King of the Jews. Notice they said, "Where is this King of the Jews that's been born?" They were the first people to recognize, and therefore Matthew uses them to introduce the idea of the kingship of Jesus. The escape into Egypt and their return to Nazareth in Galilee. Matthew 2:13 through 23. Just as God had called his covenant people out of Egypt and formed them into a great nation, he was calling his unique son out of Egypt and to the land of promise. The emphasis here is that Jesus recapitulates the history of God's covenant people. The idea that, I remember when I studied in graduate level at Abilene Christian University, had a fellow that taught Old Testament, and he was really powerful against the idea of double fulfillment of prophecy, like called my son out of Egypt, Hosea passage, and Jesus, and he didn't call it recapitulation, but that's it. Remember, it's the same God at work. And when he finds a good way to do something, he reserves the right to do it more than once. You can call it recapitulation, whatever you want to, but it is a pattern that shows us, and here is the significance of it. This is not to prove that the Bible is divine or anything like that. It is to show that God, the same God, was God of the Old Testament, that is the God of the New Testament. The terrible slaughter of the boy children in and around Bethlehem foreshadows the deadly opposition of the Jewish authorities, both civil and religious, which would result in his death on a Roman cross. And then the return to Nazareth in Galilee. It is significant that Galilee was despised by the Jewish leaders who lived in Jerusalem. The exact significance of the term Nazarene and which of the prophets said that the Messianic kings should bear this title is not really known to us. It's one of those mysteries that the people of the time, I have no doubt, knew what they were talking about, but we don't have sufficient information. Now, there's a lot of people that find that very frustrating. So frustrating, they'll make up all kinds of stories to find out, answer the question. But remember, again, if the text of the Bible doesn't answer a question about God's work, there is no other source. You can speculate, you can make up plausible theories, but that's all they are, plausible. Don't dare tell people that's the answer, because it's not. And we'll close by suggesting ways you can use this lesson to change the way you live your life with, in, and before people. First of all, remind yourself constantly that the spiritual blessings you enjoy are the result of the work of God in history through thousands of years. That's one thing that we Gentiles have lost. The Jews were very conscious that God had been working through them from the time of Abraham. They could tell you how many years it had been since Abraham. Can you do the same thing? If not, get you a good Bible dictionary and read up on it. And keep reminding yourself that you are the point person in your life of that plan of God. And that will enrich your life immensely. And also remind yourself constantly that of the great suffering of many people, beginning with the slaughtered boy babies in and around Bethlehem, and running like a scarlet thread, which includes Jesus, the apostles, the martyrs of the early church, and those who were your spiritual ancestors who died that you might have an opportunity to believe. Pray regularly for those who are still dying because they share your faith in Christ. Pray regularly for the Holy Spirit to help you live in a way that honors those who have gone before you. Thank you, and have a good day.